They may be watching you, but I'm watching them. This is Gabriel Custodiet. Just to let you know that the episode you're about to listen to is going to be great, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. If you're new to privacy or looking for a clear vision of next steps, start by going to escapethetechnocracy.com. All our cutting-edge analysis about escaping the surveillance grid occurs exclusively on our paid newsletter, Watchman's Torch, and in our world-class video tutorials. This podcast is just a preview. This is not some game for us. We live this stuff and we consult on it. Your support means we have no sponsors and can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it on this show. Check out the show notes and escapethetechnocracy.com. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Mike from Parallel Systems. Sometimes he's called Parallel Mike, but he has a podcast, Parallel Systems, and the best place to find him is on his Substack, which is also Parallel Systems on Substack. That is his main platform these days. And Mike talks about all sorts of things. He has an interest in monetary system, corruption of the banking system and such, the economy. Going off grid is one of his themes. He's a former boxer and ultramarathon runner. Mike from Parallel Systems, welcome back to the show. Definitely, people, by the way, check out our previous episode. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Gabriel. Thanks for the second invite onto the show. I'm a fan of the show. And yeah, that was a really nice introduction. I appreciate it.
You have talked about spending a lot of time in Europe. People can tell you're originally from the UK. And I believe you talked about how you fled the UK in recent years. How, in your view, is your part of Europe holding up? Let's just say culturally, economically, how bullish are you on that part of the world at this point in time?
You know, you made me laugh a little bit then because you said, oh, you can tell you're from the UK, but I regularly get comments on my YouTube videos from people in Latin America saying, can you tone down the Irish accent, please? I can't understand you. Like, yeah, that's not Irish, buddy. So yeah, I do actually get people quite confused about the accent, but you are smart enough to recognize that it's a British accent and it's from Northern England, which actually I've toned down quite a lot since I do content, because if you actually visited that part of the world, you wouldn't understand a thing that those people had to say to you, even though they're very lovely people. But yeah,
True.
You rightly said that I left the UK and I actually relocated to Eastern Europe. So I moved to the countries that nobody really visits. These are the places that you don't hear about too much. Maybe you occasionally hear them in passing in terms of geopolitics, but they're quite silent. And, you know, Eastern Europe, for those that don't know, it's predominantly conservative. It's heterogeneous in terms of the population, very low migration. So the complete opposite of where I left, which is England. And they have some of the highest standards of living in Europe by a long, long way. You know, if you spend a few hours walking around Berlin or Paris or London or Birmingham or Rotherham, God forbid, and then go visit a place like Warsaw, which is the capital of Poland, or Tallinn in Estonia, take a train ride, go out for a meal at night, walk the streets, what you'll find is there is a massive contrast, Gabriel. The cities are clean, they're safe, they're filled with families, people out enjoying themselves. You won't see many, if any, migrants. And listen, we can argue about the benefits of some migration, but I think people know what I'm referring to when I'm talking about the kind of migration we've got in the UK. And then look at the crime rates of these countries. Pull up a chart. You know, listeners can do this right now. Pull up a chart of European violent crime. And what you'll see is topping those lists of the most dangerous countries in Europe, it's the UK, it's France, it's Germany, it's Belgium. I mean, those countries actually even rank higher than Romania, believe it or not. And then take a look at the nations that rank lowest on that list, and you'll see a whole host of Eastern European nations, Baltic countries and the Balkans. You'll see Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, Lithuania. They now rank as some of the safest countries in Europe. And the ironic part about that, Gabriel, is if you go back to the 1990s when Soviet communism collapsed, the most dangerous countries in the world were these countries. Poland was the most dangerous country in Europe for a time. And now it's the safest in Europe. And that's in the space of, what, we're talking 30 years. So the transformation's been massive. And then let's look at the economic situation of those countries that I'm discussing. Poland's economy has doubled in size over the past 2 decades. It was one of the only countries in the world that didn't have a recession during the GFC. And the purchasing power adjusted for income per capita is going to surpass the UK and Japan within a few years. But I can tell you, having spent a lot of time in these countries, for a fact that people have a way, way higher standard of living than in England or in the West. These nations that used to be sat atop of the empire. Britain was the empire on which the sun never set. People there think they're wealthy because they're living in this afterglow of a narrative that actually never existed. Because when Britain was at the height of the empire, most people lived in abject poverty. It was only after the empire collapsed that Britain actually became somewhat tolerable, and it only lasted about 30 years. From let's say 1945 to 1970, and then the collapse really took hold. And if you do go to the UK, you already feel like you're in a post-collapse society, but you're not. This is still supposed to be the good times when the housing bubble still exists and unemployment hasn't hit 15% yet, like the Great Depression. So, yeah, when you look at these Eastern European countries, their economies are still growing, and Poland is going to be an extremely wealthy country in the next 10, 20 years. The growth has been pretty much consistent for 30 years, and I don't see that stopping. So, if you are looking for some sleeper places that are not on everyone's radar, but the cost of living is low, property is still affordable, it's safe, it's clean, those are the places to look. And whilst they might not be fantastic places forever, you can always find reasons to, throw a country out and say, oh, this could happen, that could happen. But I'll tell you now, right now, those places are fantastic. And I know you've spent time in Europe as well, Gabriel. I don't know if you've been that far into Eastern Europe, but if you haven't, I'd definitely recommend you give it a try. And then maybe you could give listeners your own feedback as well.
How about this, Mike? Since you hinted at it, and this is something you're really good at, I want to just leave this fairly open ended, big question. I'll let you take it how you want it. So after World War II, Europe changes in dramatic ways. There's all sorts of things happening from a monetary economic perspective, the rise of the European Union. I wonder if you could tell a story from your different mindset, your different take on things. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit of a story. I know it's a big question, but your view, what happened to Europe from 1945 onward to get us to where we are, and maybe some of the salient points that people don't appreciate as much as they should.
Yeah, well, I think the deal that was made in the Bretton Woods system was that the allies of the US would benefit greatly from the US as a hegemon. And that obviously it was an economic alliance and it was a trade alliance. If you go back to 1945 and what happened in the years that preceded that, the US was the largest exporter in the world for some time. And if you look at the nations that really thrived after that, it was Germany and Japan, which were the two defeated nations. Japan had two nuclear bombs dropped upon it. Although sometimes today, Gabriel, people say nukes don't exist. So I don't know how many rabbit holes you've been down, but I put that one to one side. It doesn't matter to me. It got bombed, and that's all we need to know. But Japan had their industry completely totaled, same as Germany. But that also paved the way for those two nations to completely revamp their industry. And, when you take out an entire industry, you take down all the factories, you take down all of the pre-existing infrastructure, that allows you to immediately harness the latest technologies as well. So Japan and Germany got back up and running really quickly, and they actually became some of the largest exporters in the world themselves. They became industrial powerhouses. But all of this was dependent on the US. And if you go back to the 1950s, I think it was Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of the UK, he said, Brits have never had it so good. And for once, a politician told the truth. It was true. Brits had never had it so good because, as I alluded to earlier, if you go back to the height of the empire, you had children aged under 2 working in coal mines. Full-time job in a coal mine. They actually had to make laws, Gabriel, towards the end of the 1800s to stop putting children in coal mines. That was the only way they could stop the slave labor. That was what life was like for the working class in Great Britain 100 years prior, when Britain was supposedly the richest empire that had ever existed. And it was true, but all that wealth was held in the top rungs of society. It was family capitalism. So it was essentially an aristocratic system. The people at the very top got all of the spoils, and the people at the bottom were enslaved. And, I won't prolong the point, but as you got to the end of the 1800s, you actually had a lot of internal uprisings from the working classes who had just had enough. This was around 1900. And it was so bad at one point, there was over 4 million workers striking in the UK, which back then the population was much smaller. That was a huge amount they actually sent gunboats. The Royal Navy sent gunboats up the River Mersey, which was Liverpool, to try and quell the riots. So they actually turned the military on them. Now, funnily enough, World War One came just after that. So this was a society that was on the edge and it was at breaking point. And then you had World War One, which absolutely changed the direction, and all of those men that had been striking will have been sent off to war just after that. Now, I would argue that we're in a similar time period, actually, where we're seeing an ailing empire that's old, it's infirm, it can no longer live up to its own mythos, it can no longer provide the promises that it gave to its citizenry. And so it's trying to keep the appearance, and of course, I'm talking about the US here, it's trying to keep the appearance of dominance and hegemony, whilst internally it's actually on all metrics starting to really fall apart. And so I think there's a lot to learn from looking back at that period of history. And then as you go out from that period, 1945 to let's say 1970, yeah, those were the glory years, Gabriel. And I know you was probably a young lad back then. Maybe you wasn't even born. But if you go back and look at the economic metrics, for example, let's say if you look at what it cost to buy the average priced house in the UK back in 1970, it was 2 to 4 times the average salary. At certain points, you could buy the average house for 2 times the average salary. Now, you fast forward to when we was coming of age, it was 10 times. And that was the debasement of the system. It was gutting it from inside. It was hyper financialization. And that's why a lot of people today, of course, are now in the exact same position as those workers were back in 1900. When they look at the system, they look at society and they say, I've got no stake in this. And now they're being radicalized, of course, because that's what they do to try and keep them occupied. So those people now are not fighting for better conditions in terms of salary or a fairer shake in life. They're fighting because of green hair and gender and all kinds of nonsense. But sadly, that's what happens at this point in the cycle is the young people start to revolt. In wealth inequality right now is as bad as it's ever been over the past 100 years. It's worse. So all of these things are coming to the surface, and yeah, maybe I've kind of given you an interesting random answer to that, but I do think there's a lot of parallels, and I do think looking back at history will give you let's say, a good map to follow in terms of what we're likely to see. Now, it's not going to tell you exactly what's going to happen, but the reasons why I've had pretty good predictive capacity in terms of what we're going to see, and why also I would say I've been able to not fall into propaganda narratives about some kind of glorious renaissance is because that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen historically speaking. It would be a complete anomaly, an economic one, a historical one, and so I think I'd rather trust history and probabilities than I would propaganda. That's just me. And it served me pretty well. And I think listeners, there's plenty of good books out there on these time periods of history. You do have to select carefully, but a more mainstream one that I could recommend would probably be Lords of Finance. It's certainly it's a mainstream book, so it has some propaganda in there, but it's pretty good. It gives you a nice discussion on history in terms of the World War One to World War II period and what happened at the economic level.
That's the second time that book's been recommended in 2 weeks. Tom Bodrovic's also recommended that one, so people should definitely pick it up. I have it ready to read here.
The only reason I'm laughing is because I'm friends with Tom, as I know you are, and me and Tom have a lot in common. So I'm laughing because it's like, of course, Tom recommended it.
Right. Now, don't take this the wrong way, because I have learned a bit from the Marxists, their critiques, not their solutions, obviously. What you just said in the last few minutes, you could imagine, let's say, a Marxist explaining the problems in that particular way. So I wonder, what role does free markets play in your view of the problems or the solutions of humankind, especially maybe as it applies to the period that you just mentioned? Does that make sense?
I think probably what triggered your question would just be that phrase wealth inequality.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to pick apart anything. Just to ask more generally, do you think that free markets, a lot of people who are anarcho-capitalists or libertarians will say that free markets will solve so many things, and it's just the absence of free markets that has been the problem. Do you subscribe to that? And if not, or how deeply do you subscribe to any of those narratives?
I don't necessarily subscribe to any narrative. I think if you look at how things have worked historically, the framework is always the same. It's you have some outsiders go to a place, they go there and enact a great taking. So they destroy the local populaces and they take the land and the resources, and then they build an empire off of the wealth. It's what the British did in terms of colonialism, it's what the French did, it's what the Dutch did, and it's what the Americans did. And that's just the way it goes. That's history. You have empires rise, empires fall. There's no good guys in history. Everyone's out to get what they can. And if I always say to people who say, "Oh, these colonialists, they were terrible." And it's like, well, what do you think would have happened if those boats had been pointed in the other direction, that have been sending across gifts and cakes? I don't think so. That have been invading and taking stuff. Now, I'm not going to make any moral judgments on any of it, but that's usually how it starts, is the land and the resources and the wealth is coalesced in the hands of some. And then, of course, they build an empire or a nation off of that. And then what you have is corruption sets in, and over time, the promises that are kept to the population start to falter. They can no longer be maintained because growth is not infinite, and there's only so many other nations you can invade. There's only so many foreign colonies you can hold, as the British Empire showed us, or as the US is showing us right now. There's only so many military bases you can fund. There's only so many countries you can blackmail and coerce. And all empires have to maintain the empire, but at some point, it starts to implode from within because they have to use debt to continue to provide the populaces with the bread and circuses. That's what happened in Rome. Towards the end, the denarius had no silver left in it. They just debased it and debased it. And they tried to keep people entertained to stop internal revolt, but ultimately it's impossible. So I guess my view on it all is a historic view that actually it's not about an economic system. The idea of free markets is fundamentally flawed because no markets are free. Crony capitalism will always arise. It starts out free, and then over time it degrades until you get to the point where you just have a very small few people who have lots of wealth concentrated in their hands. They buy the political system off, and they create whatever dystopia they want to create. And I think we're in that stage of the cycle now. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that I'm against free markets. Absolutely, it's the best of the West. It's the best system we've got. And if you can get us back to something like that, where at least you've got a low level corruption of free markets, that usually comes early in the cycle, not right at the beginning. Actually, it's actually something that happens usually, I would say, a quarter of the way through to halfway through. If you look at China right now, for example, it's not free market. They've got kind of an essence of old style state top down capitalism. Similar, I guess, in a similar way to the family capitalism of Great Britain, just a very different model, but it's not that dissimilar. And eventually it does end up with free markets, but it's always transitory. And I think that's the key part of all of this, is understanding that all of these things are cyclical. Nothing lasts forever. So the people in America right now, the capitalists, the rebel capitalists who are saying, we just need to go back to free markets. It's like, no, you can't go back to free markets when all of the news, all of the media, all of the corporations and all of the wealth is coalesced in a very small few hands. It would not be free. It can never be free. You'd have to purge the system somehow, reset it, and then you would have a clear ground to go back to something that was free market. And you'd maybe get another 100 and 150 years good shake of it, and then it would descend into the same thing, because there's a Pareto principle that exists where over time, wealth and power will always start to slowly, and then suddenly, very quickly, concentrate itself in the hands of a few. And the people who band together, the people who are willing to do the dastardly deeds and, do under backroom and under the table deals with one another and create monopolies or cartels, they will do that. And if you don't do that, they will. And then they'll eat you up and kick you out. And this is just human nature. This isn't about what's the best system. It's actually, I look at things, I would say, from a historical perspective, but you could go even deeper into it than that and say this is about human beings. It's about recognizing our capacity for corruption and for good and evil. So I think all systems will trend towards, decay and entropy and monopolism or monopolyism. I don't know if that's the word, monopolism. So I think that's where we are. We're at that point. And, we can't just reverse that by saying, oh, let's open up free markets when all of that still exists. You'd have to take apart that structure. But these things have a way of self-correcting too. I'm not advocating for some kind of revolution. That never works. Not for us guys. It would be terrible. I'm definitely not advocating for that. But these things naturally will course correct because implosion happens. All empires fail. We're not sat here talking about the Roman Empire or the Venetians or the Dutch Empire. All those nations are gone, and the same thing will happen to this one, and it will create and pave the way for something better. And that's the time you really want to add philosophy to the situation. That's the time where you want people to understand free markets, read some Ayn Rand, and actually have a base understanding of economics, so that you can hopefully install something that's better. And that's our best hope, I think, Gabriel.
I want to ask a different version maybe of this question and get us into gold and start with a big picture question, then hone into a more specific questions about individual acquisition of gold, because at the end of the day, your main philosophy is that we need to take responsibility for ourselves. So what role does gold play in your view of history and how things have degraded and the cycles that they go through in terms of, we can throw in terms like the gold standard, money versus currency. How big of the geopolitics of gold is something that people talk about? This nation has this amount of gold and all the rest. How much does gold play into your view of history and how cultures and economies sway?
Yeah, well, really, the history of gold is the history of the world, because over the last 5,000 years, it's been a story of gold acquisition and gold as money. And it's only really the last 50 years out of 5,000 years where it hasn't been money. And we've seen what that experiment has done. And I think it was I think it was Winston Churchill who said gold is the worst form of financial system. The gold standard is the worst form besides all the others. I think that's just proven through history. It's not that gold is somehow extraordinary, although it does have extraordinary properties. There is a reason why people chose gold and why it was selected. And we don't need to get into that. People can easily figure that out. And I'm certainly not here to convince anyone that we should be going back to a gold standard. That's not my case. What I talk about is how people protect their wealth during these periods of history. And I think everyone should take the time to learn about different asset classes and also to learn their own monetary history so they can understand the reasons and rationale for things, how things behave, and why, even if you want something else to be used at this point in history, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be. And we can talk about that more in a second. But, here's an example. Like if I gave you an ounce of gold or a bag of silver right now, Gabriel, you could pick your time in history over the last 5,000 years. You could go back to any point during that and you'd be able to buy food, clothes, shelter, a maiden to keep you company at night. If that's your thing, you'd be fine. But there's nothing really else out there with that kind of longevity. There is nothing. There's no currency, of course. All currencies collapse. You could say, well, what about a bag of wheat? Well, the bag of wheat would have long since gone off. What about oil? Well, yeah, oil only lasts a certain amount of time, and then you've got to use it as well. So there's nothing else like gold for that wealth preservation role. And the other reason why people love gold is because it's physical. It cannot be defaulted on. Everything else could be defaulted on. It's something that you can hold in your possession. It doesn't require somebody keeping a power station running or digital accounting records to exist or trusting complex systems that actually we don't really understand and they're not in our control. So it's got that level of autonomy that you'd really want if you was trying to protect wealth, not just for 5 years, not just for 10 years, but for 100 years, for 500 years, for 1,000 years even. And certainly that may not be our time horizon, but it's the time horizon of some people. If you're a billionaire sat there right now, let's say you're Jeff Bezos and you've got hundreds of billions, your time horizon is epochs. You're thinking, okay, I've got all of this money. How am I going to protect my family for the next 5 generations, 10 generations? And, if you look at the royal families, they're thinking, okay, how do we keep our dynasty going for thousands of years? They actually think that way. So that's why gold has always been selected. And that's why it's not going anywhere, because it's already possessed by so many people. Now, some people today would say, well, it's a barbarous relic. And we've transcended gold. We've transcended history with gold. But that's not actually the case. It's not what we're seeing. Central banks are buying record amounts of the barbarous relic, and they have been for a number of years. It's outperformed the S&P 500 since the dot-com crash. That's 25 years, not by a little, by 300%. And there's a big difference between gold and the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is a financialized asset. If you're buying an index or if you're buying companies, you're exposed to all kinds of counterparty risk. You're taking on risk for reward. So technically speaking, that should be far outperforming gold, because gold, you're not taking on that risk. You don't have a counterparty risk. However, that's not the case. Gold's outperforming the risk assets, which shouldn't be happening, which tells us something important about the financial system, about the debasement of fiat currency, that these gains that we're seeing in the stock market are artificial. They're not real, because the safest asset out there is outperforming it. Well, gold's not meant to move up in value. It's meant to be stable to protect your wealth. So if gold's going up in value higher than the stock market, it tells us that the currency is being debased, and gold is just accounting for that. It's the same with housing. I put out a note on my Substack just the other day that if you sold your house in England in the year 2000 and put the proceeds into gold, you got 570 ounces of gold. 25 years later, that 570 ounces of gold would buy you 4 houses. So essentially, your house has lost 75% of the value over the last 25 years. But people don't see it that way, because they say, oh, look, my house was 100 grand. Now it's 350 grand. That means I've done really well. It's like, no, you've been wealth stripped. You just don't know it. And that's what's happening in the system right now. So, gold is the most trusted, most desirable, safest asset in the world. It's the most liquid asset in the world. And it's up 40% in 12 months. And historically, it's always been the case that it is the bridge from one financial system to the other. And I don't see that changing. In fact, I would say everything that we're seeing right now points very strongly in that direction. And you can look at it from a geopolitical aspect. China's got an estimated now 40,000 tons of gold. Russia, I'd say around 12,000 tons. So this is what happens towards the end of a system. There's a huge loss of faith in the old system. And the old system was built on 3 pillars. It was built on the US dollar or US treasuries as a trusted reserve asset. It was built on US military being a protectorate of the trade routes. And from pillar 1 and pillar 2, we got pillar 3, which was globalized trade. Now, if you look at what's happening in the world right now, all 3 of those pillars are falling apart. The US treasuries are no longer trusted. That's happening through de-dollarization. It's happening through a collapse in the price of bonds, US long bonds. Nobody wants them. They can't issue 20, 30, 40-year bonds and get the demand they need. So they're having to do it at the short end of the yield curve. And that's because people are saying, well, I don't trust that you're going to pay me back. And also, you're issuing papers with Steve Moran, who's the chair of Trump's economic advisors, literally saying, why don't we force them to give back those treasuries that we've promised to repay them on, and force them to take a 100-year bond with no yield, which is essentially a default. So when you've got the global hegemon saying that publicly, well, it doesn't sound too attractive, does it? I wouldn't put my money there, and I'm sure you wouldn't either. So everything that we're seeing right now points that they're going to do what they always do, which is reset versus gold. That's why the central banks are buying at record levels. And, those other pillars that I mentioned, the US military, well, they're no longer protecting their allies. They're actually using that military to loot and to, enact. Nord Stream got blown up. You can argue who did that, but I think the world knows who did that. And then the final one, world trade, world tariffs are being enacted across the world. So that's protectionism. That's the opposite of globalization. It's becoming more insular. And so when you have the 3 pillars of the old system taken out, that means the old system's about to die. It's a very logical and simple way of looking at it. And it's observable in everything that's happening, particularly since the second Trump presidency is sped up. So that's why we're in that middle bit. We're in the bit between the old system and the new system. And that bit historically is always, always war, usually global war, or at least over the last 500 years. And it's also economic warfare. And it's, you have all kinds of things happening. Migration flows change, infrastructure and energy crises can emerge. And then ultimately, you'll have a jostling for position of all of the world's elites. And I'm talking about the people who have the reins of power, not necessarily nations, although we might see it as nations because it plays out that way. But what you see is a jostling for power as people say, well, the old system's gone. Now we want a bigger slice of the cake, or we want to take what that person's got, or we need to secure essential resources or rare earths. And we're seeing all of that play out too. It's just the narratives that we've been given are somewhat suspect. You could, the narratives are always going to be the same. It's going to be heroic for your country. Your country's doing the right thing. Your country's, the victor and the hero in the story. But actually, it's very much a typical narrative that we're seeing. And these are dangerous times of history for sure. And in terms of wealth, your goal right now shouldn't necessarily be to take on a lot of risk. It should actually be to work from the bottom up, which is to protect what you've got first and foremost, because usually the returns in risk assets during this period of history are very low or negative. If you go back to the last reset, or you could call it the changeover from the old system to the next system, which was the Bretton Woods system, we had two world wars, we had the Spanish flu, we had the 1929 stock market crash, and then we had the Great Depression. So that's kind of your template you're looking at. Then we got the Bretton Woods system collapse, which I would say was another reset. It was an interim reset. You had the pound lose 90% of its value over the course of 10 years. You had stagflation. You had oil shocks. You had massive unemployment. And actually, the UK stock market did worse over that 10-year period in real terms than it did during the Great Depression. So these are the kind of periods of history that I look to and I say, okay, well, what we're living through is worse than those two periods because the financial system is far greater, the debt's far greater. So if those two are the templates of what a good reset looks like, an easy one, well, I'm thinking, okay, it's probably going to be worse than that. It's going to be more challenging. So that's when you start to take notice a little bit and think, okay, how do I protect my wealth through this? But not just my wealth, also my skin. There's going to be wars, there's going to be cyber attacks, there's going to be supply chains collapsing, supply chain disruption. And obviously, there's an agenda too to actually use this reset as a stepping stone to technocracy. As you well know, my friend, you've got to escape the technocracy course. So clearly, you're watching some of this and saying, okay, well, I'm starting to see that there's a drive here to take us towards maybe a more controlled system, not a system of liberty, but a system of tyranny potentially. So you've got to think about that too. And that's why you've got to see yourself as you are on the chessboard, whether you like it or not. The big pieces are moving around, and you need to try and move your little pawn piece to a safer spot. And sometimes that might mean moving multiple times. Doug Casey once said on one of his shows, that you could have been in, let's say you was having a lovely time in Germany. No, let's say you was in Czechoslovakia, and then the Nazis you hear rumblings that the Nazis are going to be invading. So you think, I know, I'm going to go to one of those nice Pacific islands. And then a few years later, you're getting bombed to bits. So you don't know how this is going to unfold. You might think, oh, I've got an idea. Maybe I'll go to this country, that country. But because of the nature of these times in history and the chaos that can ensue, you could still find yourself put in harm's way. So yeah, you have to have your binoculars out to look out for what's coming down the pipeline. But first and foremost, don't get wiped out financially. Protect your wealth, and gold is historically, and as I said, it's been playing out that way as well for the last 50 years, is a very good option for wealth preservation. And then you can talk about silver too, I guess, but there are differences between the two metals.
Very, very good reasoning there. And yes, of course, you did not want to be off-grid in the Solomon Islands in August of 1942. And it is certainly something to consider how quickly that people and governments and armies can cross borders these days. It is hard to escape. Now, honing in to individual acquisition of gold, it's really difficult to beat just ounces of gold, Krugerrands, or what have you in your physical possession that you buy privately and that you store and hide in a safe place. I'm just curious, though, your thoughts on, let's say we wanted to start using this now. What are your thoughts on Goldbacks?
Goldbacks are interesting. What state is it, Gabriel, that has these? Is it Utah?
So they print them in a number of states. They're really honing in on Florida these days.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I like this idea that there's a local economy forming and people are coming up with these innovative solutions with these notes, and they're very pretty as well. I really like the artwork on the Goldbacks. So I would never criticize them because I think it's a nice innovation and it's somebody trying to come up with solutions so you can spend them. The problem, I guess, with them is firstly, the markup's very high on them. I actually looked at some not so long ago, and I think it was 100% markup.
It's 100%. And the CEO is basically saying, yes, well, but what we've done is we've used our patented process. We've made this into incredibly small denominations, like 1/2,000th of an ounce. And we've made beautiful designs, and we made it look like a banknote so you can easily trade it back and forth. And that's what he said is the 100% premium.
Yeah, well, that's fine. You can say that, and it can dress it up, and it's like putting I remember when I was a kid, if you went to the supermarket, you could buy the tin of beans that had the nice looking package or the tin of beans that had just the white paper around it and it said beans on it. And if you bought them, they tasted just the same. So am I going to pay 100% more for the fancy looking wrapper on the other tin of beans? Probably not. And I'd say it's probably the same problem with the Goldbacks. At the end of the day, gold is the most liquid asset on planet Earth. You can go to any country and within an hour, in a major city, you'd easily be able to convert some gold for currency. You could take it to a bullion dealer, you could take it to a jeweler's, you could take it to a pawn shop. It really is like a currency in that regard, only it's the most trusted and valued currency everywhere and anywhere you go. Now, if you pulled out a wallet full of goldbacks in, let's say you was in, I don't know, let's say you was in Prague, it's probably not going to work. Firstly, no one's going to accept them. They're not going to have no idea what you're pulling out your wallet. They'd accept the local currency, they'd accept the Czech koruna, but they ain't going to accept your goldbacks. And secondly, if you took them to a bullion dealer, they'd say, we can't resell these. If you could pull out a Krugerrand, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I could sell a Krugerrand tomorrow." They literally could sell it in an instant online to another dealer. It's the most liquid asset in the world, but a goldback probably not. So if you was asking me, do I want to pay 100% for something that has very little to virtually no liquidity in most places? I'd say no. I'd just buy the gold, and the gold could be converted into the local currency. But like I said, I don't want to criticize it. It's a good innovation, but ultimately liquidity matters, and I think that's one of the reasons why people like gold, particularly, is that liquidity. And if you take away that from it, then you've actually lost one of the key characteristics of gold that people look for. So yeah, nice idea, but I think we're probably going to get to something that's a little bit smarter eventually, Gabriel. And it may require some people to it may require people to kind of accept ideas that maybe they wouldn't normally, digital currencies, for example, with some kind of gold system. I think that's going to be more useful in a modern economy. I'm not saying that I particularly would like that, but that would be the most useful way to actually get gold back into the economy in a way that people would accept. If you go to the local coffee house and you're using a digital token that actually has redeemability in physical gold that's held in a state vault. This is something that they're trying to achieve now in many states in the US. That seems like a good compromise to me. That seems like a good compromise that I could pay that way and the person has to do nothing special, doesn't have to accept something. I don't have to stand there and tell them all about, well, this is what it is and this is how it works. And I don't have to pay 100% premium for the privilege. I can do it at spot or close to spot, and then I can go redeem it, or the shopkeeper can go redeem it if they want into physical bullion, or they can keep it there stored if they don't. That to me seems like a smarter way of doing it. What do you think, Gabriel? What's your thoughts on it?
Well, the Goldbacks, the co-founder was making the point that this isn't really about gold. This is about having a competing currency, I guess, to the dollar and other things, and that he's just tapping in halfway to the gold market. But it's really just about having a pretty design that's easy to use, that people are interested in. I guess he says it is spreading worldwide at this point. And the anti-counterfeiting measures, they put a lot of time and attention to that. So I come down to, if people want to use something as money, absolutely go for it, and we can see how it goes from there. But and he was kind of making the point that it's not even really competing with gold in his view. It's not really. He said it has more in common with Bitcoin than with gold, because he's trying to, I guess, I don't know, be a competitor to the dollar and not, joining the precious metals market. But you might give that episode a listen. I interviewed him recently and see what you think.
Yeah, I think the big problem would be, like, if you wanted to take those gold backs to somebody to redeem it for currency, they would have to accept that. And of course, gold can easily be reformed. You just put it under some flames and you've got your gold back. So it's very simple. Anybody could do it. You could do it in your own backyard if you really wanted to. I'm not sure how that would work with the gold backs as a note with polymer, I'm guessing, is used on it. So yeah,
You can
I
melt
think
them
for all
down.
those,
Yeah, you can
go ahead.
theoretically melt them down into the particles, but you're losing half the value certainly when you do that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's I guess I'm a charitable person and I like people who are making innovative ideas. But if my charity requires me to lose, half of my investment immediately, I'd probably not advise anyone to do that myself.
Yeah.
unless I was in a place that was, yeah, if it was gonna be like a community thing and everyone was doing it and everyone was accepting it, maybe, but
Mhm.
still, yeah, I just think you'd have to get that markup down, I guess, to make it really
Right.
viable.
Well, for example, at the libertarian event in New Hampshire recently, Pork Fest, I think it's called, somebody said that they were basically a lot of people were just using goldbacks as their currency, and there's a lot of places, especially in the U.S., people just accepting goldbacks and accepting that 100% premium as part of the deal. So, like, Godspeed to everybody, and I'm happy to get an alternative to the U.S. dollar that people are accepting as valuable. So I say, hey, may
Exactly,
the
I'm the
best man
same.
win.
Yeah, I totally think, I'm totally the same. I don't think that's why I said at the start, like, I don't think it's a bad idea, and I applaud anyone for trying to come up with solutions. It really is just a case of personal preference. If something works for you, whether it's junk silver, whether it's Monero, whether it's gold, you do you, as long as you're kind of trying to come up with solutions from, this debt-based paradigm that we're all suffering under, then right on.
Let me move us into a different category here. Maybe we call these questions pertaining to property and freedom. You did a show recently talking about $50,000 that was seized from a small business because the government was making the argument that money is not property. I wonder if you could explain what was going on there.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. It was actually one of my listeners that sent me, and it was a guy who had a landscaping business, and there was something to do with tax. I think there was the suggestion. It was a suggestion. He wasn't actually found guilty at that point. That maybe he hadn't paid some tax. So they came along to his work premises, and they found that he had some cash. I'm not sure if it was in his bank account or if, I think it was. I don't think it was actually cash. I think it was in his bank account. But in any case, they confiscated it. And what was interesting about this is when it went to court and it was going through the judicial system, there was a statement made in the courtroom that was, well, cash is technically not, or this money is technically not yours because we issued it. So you technically don't have property rights. And that was something that the judge said to him in court. Now, of course, that's very concerning because it's like saying, well, anything that comes from the government is theirs by default, and you actually are only borrowing it for a time. So they can at any point confiscate any amount of money from you. Now, I haven't looked into that story since that time, so I'm not sure if it's, if he got his money back or anything like this. But it was just an interesting one because we are seeing at this point in history these kinds of strange assertions, and I think this is normal for this part of the cycle where you actually see the governments and nations try to bail themselves out with our stuff. And we all know about bank bail-ins, of course, that after the 2008 GFC there was bank bail-in laws put in so that a bank that is failing can legally confiscate the deposits of their customers, people like you and I. Now, once you learn that, and then you see governments, including in the US, saying these things about money being their property or currency being their property, it does make you wonder, doesn't it? And it makes you a little bit concerned about where this could go if they get really desperate. If you go back to 1933, they confiscated the gold, or they actually nationalized it, really. But yeah, so you do see this when nations are bankrupt and they're desperate because the nation's got a debt too. And they have to pay that debt. They have to pay the interest on it at least. So they're going to try and do whatever they can to stay afloat. And if your money or cash or assets are low hanging fruit, yeah, they'll come for it. They'll take it.
One of your common topics is, or certainly as part of your background, is homesteading. How should people, if they're interested in it, what's the best way to get into homesteading?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, I say, to get into because it's a lifestyle that you're adopting. There's no such thing as really being a part-time homesteader. I actually had this conversation with somebody recently. There was a thread online, and somebody was saying all of the people that I know who went to homesteading like 4 or 5 years ago have since sold their homesteads and gone back to living in a city or having something much more modest, like a small plot in the garden. And they asked me, is this true? Is this what it's like? Is it as bad as these guys say? And I say, it's not bad. It's fantastic, but it's a lifestyle for sure. If you want to have any sized land, even just a few acres, and you plan to grow food and you plan to grow animals, there's a huge amount of responsibility, time, and labor there. You certainly aren't going to do it whilst working full time. It would be extremely difficult and probably pretty soul destroying. So if there's two of you, you're probably going to need somebody at least working part time so they can tend to the jobs. You wake up, you've got to feed the animals, you've got to tend to the garden, then you've got to harvest, you've got to water it, you've got to make sure everything's done at the right time, and then nature can just come along and screw it all up because nature works to her own agenda. She doesn't do everything when you want it to happen. She does it when she wants it to happen. And that's just the cycles you have to live within. Then, of course, you've got to harvest it, and now you've got an abundance of stuff that you can't eat all at once. So you might have thousands of apples. When I harvest my apples, I go from having no apples, Gabriel, to 1,000 apples or 2,000 apples. Well, you can't eat 2,000 apples, and things start to rot over time. So now you've got to spend all evening preserving it. And this is a 24/7 thing, and it's 365 days a year. If you want to go travel for a week, well, who's looking after your animals? They're all going to die. Who's going to look after your garden? If you don't water that thing for 2 days, 3 days in summer, months and months of time and effort is wasted. It will all die. You'll come back to nothing. So there's definitely a big amount of responsibility to it. So when you talk about how do you get into homesteading, that's not the hard bit, is saying, oh, you can learn how to plant and how to grow. Although there's definitely a big learning curve there too as well. People think, oh, farming's easy or growing food's easy. And it's kind of like, no, not really. It's quite difficult. It takes a good few years, I would say, to get up to speed. However, that's just talking about the responsibilities, and for people who like responsibility and want to be more independent, because let's face it, there is no other solution for combating the risks when it comes to supply chain disruptions or water supply being shut down or energy grid collapse or a solar flare. And I'm not this kind of doomsday prepper, but if you don't notice that these things are actually happening more frequently and that we're going into a period of great conflict, and then you probably got your eyes closed and your ears shut off, because it is happening and it's becoming more prevalent, and it's normal for it to happen. So if you want to protect yourself from that, then I guess it's the only real solution to do it. But I would say there's a lot of benefits too. It takes you back to some, more natural way of living. It definitely decreases your dependency on the system. So, when I hear of people who are talking a lot about investing money and trying to earn money on Bitcoin or whatever it is, and they're like, yeah, I've got all of these assets that are digital and this, that, and the other. And it's a case of like, well, if we have a real crisis, they're not going to help you. They're not going to be of use at all. In fact, you could just lose it all. If you have it, if I speak to somebody and they've got like a few million in investments and they're completely dependent on the local food store and completely dependent on the energy system or the water system or whatever, on society just functioning for them to survive, and they couldn't make it more than 5 days on their own without literally going into some serious collapse in their own internal world, then I think they've probably got it wrong, Gabriel. I think you've probably screwed up. I think your ancestors will be calling back from epochs before, saying, "Are you crazy?" We used to have a 6 month or a 12-month food store. If we had excess cash, we'd have more land and we'd plant more, because people understood back then the fragility of life, and the fragility of these complex systems that we've got is immense. We just don't realize it because it's functioning. But they say, if it goes down for 2-3 days, people will go back to behaving like chimpanzees. And if you look back at the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's certainly what happened. And it was a very dangerous time. So I think if have the means and you are overly concerned with the material wealth and you're not thinking about survival, I think you probably got it back to front. So for those reasons, I'm a huge fan of homesteading. It does take you back to nature. If you move to a place that you enjoy, you're not going to mind spending a lot of time there. Of course, if you've got other people in your family who can maybe help out a bit, that's useful. It might allow you to kind of travel a bit more and not be so tied to the land. And, that's kind of what we do. But in essence, yeah, to get into it, I think you've got to want it and really know what you're getting yourself into and actually embrace that and truly embrace it. And then actually the other stuff will just fall into place. You can watch some YouTube videos, you can get some books, Start simple and just build it out over 3, 4, 5 years. And by the time you get 5 years in, you'll have the capacity to do way, way more than you could have in the first year anyways.
Very well said. Now that's enough practical stuff. Mike, I want to get back to some of the bigger picture questions here as we wind down. Just your thoughts on economics. And I want to ask you this question because this is something that we hear often, that if you don't replace your population with new offspring, whatever that number is per person, then your economy is going to be in serious trouble. This has been something that's been used to really justify unfettered immigration and other sorts of things. What is the merit of that argument that population is crucial for an economy, for a country, for a place to thrive?
This is the demographics is destiny argument. And historically speaking, it was somewhat true because it, of course, gives you a huge capacity in terms of building out your industry and people paying tax. However, we're quickly moving away from that old world. It's kind of like the argument of having the largest army is going to make you the strongest nation. Well, that could have been true back in Napoleon's era, for example. You go meet the Russians and you're in a lot of trouble because they've just got so many bodies they can throw at it. But in the modern era where you've got nuclear bombs and drone warfare and nano swarms and all kinds of crazy advancements, actually, you probably don't need a massive army. You could use a bioweapon, for example, and it wouldn't, you're not sending your men out to war at all. So my point is that this old idea of demographics being destiny has certainly shifted because right now we're going through the fourth industrial revolution, whether we like it or not. So we've got lots and lots of capacity being taken out because of AI and the use of automation and 3D printing, all of these different advancements that are making it so society is going to shift dramatically. Maybe not tomorrow, but we're kind of in the early innings of that. And if you fast forward 10, 20, 30 years, you could certainly see why there would be a need for far few. I wouldn't say a need, but why they may foresee that we actually don't need that many people. We could replace out maybe 40, 50% of these processes and jobs that people have today with automation. And I think we're already starting to see it, but it's going to be, if we fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, Gabriel, the advancements will be way, way ahead of where we're at now. So I think they're setting up for that world. And that's why the demographics no longer are as important. And I think it's a collective decision that's been made. If you go back to the Club of Rome and the limits to growth, I think a lot of that was just propaganda to allow them to do what they're doing now and to get us to go along with it, because essentially we're being told, you're not needed anymore, guys. And some of you are going to have to go. That's really the message, right? So yeah, I think that's what they're setting up for is a post-industrial world where the commodities will still exist and you will still have humans working in certain industries because they need to keep these data centers and the infrastructure and electric energy grids and electricity running. So you're definitely going to have people, but how many people do you need? Do you need people who work in Starbucks? Do you need the people who drive taxis? Do you need the people who work in legal when AI can do that? Probably not. It's all going to start to shift. And therefore, you don't want to maintain those populations. They will actually become a burden at that point. They will actually become a burden. Now, if you, I guess, say, well, why are they migrating a lot of people? It's not for what they're claiming, because these people don't generally work. I was looking at it today. Do you know how much the UK spends per month paying for migrants? Just giving them free money, basically. It's £1 billion a month.
Dang.
Can you imagine that the taxpayers in that country are paying £1 billion a month to pay for people who come to their country? That's not economically viable, and it's certainly not helping the country when you've got a failing NHS. And I know when I lived in the UK, it took me over a month to get an appointment to see a doctor. In Eastern Europe, I can get a doctor tomorrow. I can get a private doctor, and it's cheaper than it would be for a public doctor. So, like I said, we're seeing a huge decline in the West, and I think it's intentional. And I was having a discussion today on my podcast with a man called Jobs Landgrebe, who specializes in AI. Although he's a bit more optimistic than some, he says, he wrote a book called Why Machines Won't Rule the World. And he says, AI is a sophisticated set of algorithms. It's a sophisticated set of code, but it will never have human intelligence or consciousness. These are fanciful. And I actually agree with him. I don't think it will, but it will be very useful. It will be a tool. It will be a very sophisticated tool that can be used in a technocratic system. And I think if you want a technocratic system to work, you probably need a captive audience that are not very liberty-minded, that don't have this long legacy of democracy going back all the way to the ancient Greeks, and this long legacy of philosophy and beautiful literature and arts, which is what we've got. That's why we're free, because we are free because we think free. It's imbued in us. It's etched into our soul. Freedom, liberty, the right to choose. If you get a lot of people who are from, let's say, more savage cultures, you can mold them. And especially if they've got a fundamentalist religious view, well, that's fantastic, because you know exactly what they think. You can put them in you know where they're going to be, when they're going to be praying, and it's much more easy to control that society than it would be a group of free thinkers and anarcho-capitalists and people who like the Constitution and liberty. So I think there's a vested interest in bringing down societies that have the most freedom, and I think we're living through that now. And the demographics thing is it also works on that front too, because of course, if you bring people across to your countries, well, our nations have very low birth rates. We're talking under 2. In some European countries, it's 1.4. Well, it's well under the replacement rate. And they're not bringing these people across, in my opinion, to get them to outbreed us. They're bringing them across because they're going to end up with the same problem in 5, 10, 15 years, having lived in our culture and maybe being subjected to whatever toxins or poisons or media is causing us to have these low birth rates. Because I think it's probably, testosterone, for example, in men today, it's the equivalent of what in the 1950s an 8-year-old man had. And of course, testosterone declines over age. So clearly there's something environmental about this too. So if you've got lots of people in the global south that keep breeding and you're planning to have a future where you want less people, well, you bring them across to where you are, and then you can subject them to the same conditions that will reduce the amount of people being born as your native population. So I'd say it's probably more to do with that. I don't necessarily think they're planning to have 100 million people in Great Britain or 500 million people in Great Britain. I think it's probably going to be population decline at some point. It's just, for now, it's, we're in that transition period.
People want to hear more from Mike, parallelmike.com. As we said, his Substack is also the central place where he's releasing stuff. He does consulting. If you're interested in, let's say, acquiring precious metals or some thoughts on that, maybe homesteading and things of this sort. He's talked in the past about how he's lived on a boat in the past. Maybe reach out to him for those sorts of things, and otherwise get involved in his own community, which is full of all sorts of good people. And Mike, I'm going to give you the final thoughts here.
Yeah, not much else to say, Gabriel. Just thanks for having me back on the show. I enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to catching up again.
Hey, thanks for listening. I could really use your help real quick. If you could share this episode with someone, engage with me, leave a review anywhere. This helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, newsletters, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.